I'm sorry about that. I've stopped your time, so if you want to collect your thoughts and think about a question for someone else for a minute.
Okay. Well, I'll move to Mr. Kaufman. Mr. Kaufman, when your time ran out, you were just starting to address a topic that's interesting to me, the CBC. If you wanted to just continue your remarks from there, I may collect my thoughts to provide me with a question. Thank you.
Well, yeah, I was just sort of drawing this analogy between what's happened to trust in media in the U.S., trust in media is very low on the right. I mean, Republicans have very low trust in media. They have very low trust in academia now. In Canada, the trust in media on the right is very low. I think the trust in academia, which is coming down, has a potential to go where it is in the United States. Now, I just want to pick up on some of what Yuan Yizhu was just talking about, that when we think about the way the councils work, I mean, the allocation of funds comes from academic experts who are, because they're drawn from academia, they're going to reflect the perspectives of academia, which is a good thing in terms of quality, but in terms of ideology, I mean, just to echo a couple of studies we have, there was a study on Canada by Chris Dummett and Zach Patterson, I believe, which came out last year, which showed that 88% of Canadian academics identifies on the left. Work I've done, surveys I've done show that number to be around 75% or thereabouts, with only about 5% conservative. That slant. Now, the other thing is people who are active, who take an active role in setting policy, tend to be even further left. If they're in the humanities and social sciences, and particularly if they're active in anything to do with policy, I think they were even going to be even further left. So what we're getting is the furthest most left point, roughly, of public opinion, which is having an outsized role in setting the agenda here. And it's a valid, look, I'm saying this is if you believe that mirroring the Canadian population by race and sex is the most important thing, and it's more important than excellence, fine. That's a perfectly valid worldview. But what I'm trying to stress is this is not the worldview of most Canadians who pay tax, who support the research enterprise. And the more that the tri-councils move in this direction, they're already in this direction, and also the more you have things like diversity statements where on your application you can signal your adherence to cultural socialism or DEI, that is going to also lead to political discrimination. And political discrimination is a real thing. So just another survey fact, in surveys I did, about 45% of Canadian academics would not hire a known Trump supporter for an academic job. In the U.S., it's 40%. In Britain, a third won't hire a known Brexit supporter. Now, there could be noise in that data, but roughly speaking, there is significant political bias, and there's been a lot of studies, mainly American, showing sort of bias against any right-leaning grant applications. So right-leaning grant applications, people openly admit they would mark them down. So we've got a systematic problem, a systematic political bias, I think, in the adjudication and selection processes in these policies. And I'm just wondering what people think. Are they just going to put their heads in the sand and just go forth business as usual and hope that what's happening in the U.S. will never happen in Canada? I would like to see the councils get ahead of this problem and move to a more colorblind merit approach, and to remove political criteria such as mandatory diversity statements. These are not universal consensus values. They are partisan values, and every survey will show a big partisan gap on these questions.
Do you have any specific suggestion on how we would, if you were helping to create this new capstone organization, any specific suggestions on some kind of mechanics of that?
I think it's as simple as just removing. First of all, I don't think you should have Canada research chairs that are restricted by race and sex. First of all, I think that's the first thing. Secondly, no diversity statements where people who essentially affirm cultural socialist ideology get higher points. So I think removal of, we've seen Harvard and MIT remove mandatory diversity statements. We've seen the Washington Post editorialize against this. These things should be removed from the application form. So that's at a minimum.
That's our time.
I have. Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to move now to MP. For 6 minutes, please.
Si, Madame la Présidente,
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, witnesses, for being here. Mr. Kaufman, are you aware that there is evidentiary proof that there is this type of situation for academic research in universities, what you were referring to, DEI?
DEI in universities. I'm commenting on the Canadian Research Councils, the Canada Research Chairs, for example, that have restricted restricted hiring to particular racial and sexual groups. I'm commenting on the diversity statements, where if you affirm your commitment to DEI, your application is rated more favorably. That's sort of what I'm talking about in terms of applying ideology to the allocation of research. Now, now I think I don't know if I've answered your question, if I understood it correctly. Maybe I should have kept it in French rather than going to the translation. But what I would say is that you can't, just because people say, don't vote for there's the definition of what is political, right? What I'm saying is when you talk about how will you promote diversity and equity in your research? That is political. Just because you say don't say how will you promote voting for the Liberal Party. The definition of political is not narrowly focused upon party politics. Political ideologies. I mentioned that survey data shows very clearly that attitudes to DEI divide very heavily based on who you vote for and how you identify on a left-right axis. That means they are political. So I think this is a bit of semantics, what we've heard, really, the idea that this isn't political. It very much is.
Oui.
So I hope I've answered.
Oui, ça répond à la question.
Yes, that does answer my question. Can you tell us if there is any linkage between DEI and scientific merit?
So I used the example of this study where we looked at number of publications times the number of times they're cited. That is the standard H-index metric that is used for research assessment, and I'm willing to defend that, by the way. What we saw in the Nature paper of 2024 was very clearly that female and Hispanic or Black academics controlling for number of years in profession and for discipline had substantially lower output than white and Asian or male academics. I think it is reasonable to surmise, although I'm open to other data. I want to see data on this and scientific proof. I believe that by pursuing EDI, you are reducing research output. I would bet on that. Now, is it the biggest factor? No, it's a factor. It's going to reduce it a certain amount, and maybe that's a trade people are willing to make. Maybe they think, okay, equity and diversity is a more important factor, or let's just say we were going to have 20% or 30% equity and diversity, and we're willing to sacrifice a certain amount of research output. But I'm not sure that the Canadian taxpayer is willing to fund that and support those values. Those values are, of course, backed because, if 75% of academia is on the left, they're setting these policies. To them, this is natural and not political. I get it, but they are in a bubble. That bubble, how many academics vote for the Conservative Party? It's very small. I mentioned 10%.
Monsieur Kaufman?
So I don't think...
Mr. Kaufman, I'd just like to continue my questions. Is there any opposition to DEI and the pursuit of scientific truth?
Opposition to DEI? Sorry, opposition to DEI or... Sorry, could you repeat it?
I'll repeat. The establishment of criteria for DEI and the establishment of scientific truths. Is there any opposition between these two?
Yes, I believe that they are in opposition. I think that if they weren't in opposition, a purely colorblind merit-based hiring would, you're going to get some diversity through a colorblind merit-based program. The fact you have to rig it means you are going to compromise on excellence and scientific truth in order to achieve cultural socialism or EDI. So I think they are in tension fundamentally. It doesn't mean you're going to get no it's probably just going to result in attacks on your scientific research and pursuit of truth. It's not going to kill it. But I think that the values of the general public that supports research are what should prevail, not the values of academics, I'm afraid, or at least the vocal academics who wind up participating in these committees.
Merci. Est-ce qu'il y a des solutions
Thank you. Are there solutions you might recommend to maintain high standards in scientific research, given the atmosphere you've described?
Yeah, I would recommend, first of all, going with a colorblind approach which does not advertise grants or positions by race or sex. I would recommend removing any statements that require you to affirm cultural socialism or DEI in order to get higher points. Those are two simple recommendations. I think those would improve research excellence. They would also help to restore public faith. And if particularly, the half of the country that isn't on the same side as most academics, if they go against the research enterprise, that's going to damage research the way it's damaged belief in the CBC and mainstream media. So I think that's just a bad way for academia to go if we care about the research base and research funding.
Thank you. That's some time. So before we go to Mr. Cannings, I just want to announce that the clerk has been in touch with Dr. Zhu, and unfortunately, the volume levels are too low for the interpreter. So we've asked Dr. Zhu, or invited him to submit any further testimony by brief. And again, he's able to listen to whatever's going on. So if he has some opinion that he wants to express through a brief, he can do so. So now, Mr. Cannings, I turn it over to you for your 6 minutes.
Well, thank you. I'm going to
Thank you very much, Chair. For Mr. Kaufman, in 2023, the Supreme Court of the United States prohibited discrimination in the terms of, and that led to diversity, inclusion, and equality. There were two bills that were brought through the House of Representatives. What do you think of the path that was taken by our neighbors to the south, and what should the path be here in terms of DEI?
I think I'm very much in favor of the approach of outlawing affirmative action that's been taken, advocated by the U.S. Supreme Court in the Students for Fair Admissions case, which, let's not forget, was brought principally because of Asian Americans who are being discriminated against. But let's remember, the flip side of really what affirmative action is a euphemism for discrimination against certain groups, Asians, whites, males, essentially. There's also discrimination against conservatives, but that's not happening through affirmative action. What I would say is you look at that decision, that's been supported by not just a majority of white Americans, but a majority of Hispanic Americans and a majority of black Americans and of Asian Americans. This is a consensus value. There have been a number of referenda in California to try and reintroduce affirmative action because it's been repealed by a popular initiative, and every time they try it, it's always voted down because the public does not want racial preferences in the allocation, whether it be university places at Harvard or whether it be research grants. That's against the values. I mentioned the Canadian survey. 59% want a colorblind approach versus only 29% for a color-conscious approach. And yet, what is the approach that's being pursued? A color-conscious approach in the Tri-Council. So I think it is out of step with public opinion. They may be able to get away with it for a little longer, but ultimately, I don't think that this is going to do the research body any good.
19 seconds.
Monsieur.
Mr. Kaufman, there's some evidence about the unexpected consequences have led to misogynistic approaches. What do you think can be done to avoid this in terms of DEI?
Just a short answer, please.
Well, I think misogynistic approaches are they're contrary to the idea of judging individuals as individuals and not by their gender. So I just think a classical liberal merit-based approach where we're judging strictly on the basis of the individual is more than sufficient. Gender discrimination is against the law. It's also against the classical liberal position. I would also add that the research on...
That's our time. You can always expand on your answer in writing if you care to.